Hello, everyone. Welcome back to another episode of the Draft Series. Today, we're going to be taking a look at picks 18 to 16. It's been a couple days since we did one of these, but let's get right back into it. We'll kick things off at the number 12 position in round 18. We had Karen's husband taking Tack Arthur 104. This dude just fucking sucks at everything from video games to football, and he didn't score a single point. Um, at the number 11 position, you had J Bay taking Justin Ellis at the D line position. This is another bust, who also scored no points at all. The only reason he's above Tack Arthur 104 is because Tack Arthur 104 sucks, and because the pick was actually like 4 picks after, so I just narrowly gave it the edge just for shits and gigs. At the number 10 spot, I had Rictatorship taking. At the number 10 spot, I had Rictatorship, who ended up taking a bust here. He took Carl Davis at the D line position, who scored a whopping 3 points. Against Buffalo, he was just amazing, and after that, he fell off. Um, at the number 9 spot with Booty Basher, or at the number 9 spot, I had Booty Basher taking another bust at the D line position yet again. This time, Booty Basher takes Abdullah Anderson, who scored 21.25 points. And you know what? Week 1, he had a playable game. And then, yeah, he did great the rest of the season. Um, at the number 8 spot, here's another bust from Scramble and Wiggle Waggle this time, taking a safety, Andrew Wingard, who scored a total of 92 points. So at least he was putting up fantasy points throughout the course of the season. That's something. He had a couple okay games against Pittsburgh, against Baltimore, against San Fran. But for the most part this season, he was an absolute bust, with the exception of just those couple games that were pretty good. At the number 7 spot, I had MILF taking Unique Ngakwe, D-line, as a bust. He had 71 points, which is definitely less than Andrew Wingard, but I put him higher for a few reasons. One, defensive linemen are considerably more valuable than safeties in fantasy, and two, because of the fact that he actually did have quite a few good games, such as Week 14, Week 10, Week 1, Week 5. He actually had a few good games, and overall, I figured it was just barely better than Scrambled and Wiggle Waggled's pick, but both are busts, make no mistake about it. At the number 6 spot, I had Big Yawners taking Javon Hargrave. Now, at first, I thought I was going to give Javon Hargrave a better ranking than I did, but looking throughout his points throughout the course of the season, I'm actually going to call this another bust. He started the season out very strong, 12.5 points, 11.5 points, 13.5 points, and then he had a couple 11-point weeks. But you look at the sheer amount of times that this guy just put up basically nothing. It's kind of ridiculous. Literally half of his season was spent getting 3 points or less. And sure, he had some really good games, but if you sat here and played this guy every game throughout the season with how inconsistent he was, you'd probably lose half your games. Because this guy was just all over the fucking place. At least he showed the upside, but still, I don't even think I can call it mid just for how just terrible he was on his downsided games. At the number 5 spot, I had Toxic Zenpai taking Jerome Baker with yet another bust. This is a whole round of busts. Jerome Baker had 160 points. He had a very slow start to the season, getting no more than 11 points throughout the first quarter. Week 5, he had a pretty good week, almost getting 20 points. Week 7, he had another good week with 32 points. And he had a couple weeks where he had 13, 21 points. He had a couple good weeks, and even on his bad weeks, at least he was scoring points. But I'm still going to call him a bust, though, because there were just so many better linebackers taken, even later in the draft, as we already talked about in some of the other rounds. But still, I think this is a far better pick than the other busts. And overall, these guys just all kind of sucked. At the number 4 spot, we have our first meh of the draft here. At the round 18 position, we had PMC Wagner taking Jackson Smith and Jigba at wide receiver. This is a meh pick. I thought he was going to be a bust whenever I first looked at it, but then I saw his points. 153 points isn't fantastic, but for how late in the draft you're getting a receiver here, I would say that's actually pretty good value. He had a very, very slow start to the season. Yeah, I think everybody expected that, though. But you look at what happened after the bye week. He actually was a very formidable receiver after the course of the bye week, where he was scoring upwards of 10 to 15 points on pretty much every given week. Sure, he had a few slower weeks, such as the week against San Fran with 6 points, but even the best receivers in fantasy are going to have their bad weeks. I would say for where you got him, if you're PMC Wagner here, this is actually just an overall solid pick if you were able to hold him past the first 4 weeks of the season. I'm still going to call it meh just because of that slow start he had. But still, I'd say that's still a pretty solid pick overall, though. At the number 3 spot, you had Homeland, aka myself, Security, taking Jordan Brooks at the linebacker position. This is one of those linebackers that was just really good that was taken after Jerome Baker, which is why I gave Jerome Baker the meh pick. And I'm going to call this a hit. He had a very weak later end of the season, don't get me wrong, where he dealt with a few stupid injuries and just basically was struggling. But for the early point in the season, he was actually going toe-to-toe with a lot of the other linebackers to be the best linebacker in fantasy, getting 20, 17, 30, pretty much ranging all over the board, doing very, very well. For weeks 10 and 11, by the way, he was playing through an injury, so he barely played the snaps, but when he came back in, he ended up doing pretty good. But at the ending portion of the season, the injuries just killed him. I called it a hit more than a meh. I'd say it's very close to the borderline of hit and meh. But I called it an overall hit just for how many really, really good weeks that Jordan Brooks produced. If it weren't for the injuries, he would have been so much better, but I still got to take that into consideration, which is why it's at the number 3 spot. And I'm calling it just barely a hit, but overall, he was a very good player, and I'd keep a close eye on him in the next upcoming season. At the number 2 spot, I had Pussy taking Kansas City's team defense, who was the 6th highest scoring player / defense in all of fantasy. If you're looking for a consistent defense, this was them. Almost every week, without fail, after week 1, they scored around 20 to 30 to 40 points almost every week like it was clockwork. With that being said, they did have their occasional weeks where they only scored about 15 points, which isn't great, but to be fair, even the most consistent of defenses are going to have their bad weeks. But the biggest upside here with this Chiefs defense is pretty much on any given week, they would still just produce the same quality over and over again. They'd find a way to get not an okay amount of fantasy points, a good amount of fantasy points. And overall, I would say this is still definitely a hit. And I'd say this is definitely a top 5 team or maybe I guess we would just call it the top 6 team defense in terms of how consistent they are. But at the end of the day, when it comes to the team defenses, though, you can play the matchups and almost, not always, but a lot of the times, outscore these consistent team defenses just playing the matchups, which is why I didn't want to put it at number 1, but I can't deny that it was a very strong pick, though, so it's going to be a strong hit at number 2. And at the number 1 position, you have TJ Watt of Mr. Steeler Girl being an absolute hit. If there was any doubt about Kansas City being just an absolute team carrier, TJ Watt is that. This is the difference between TJ Watt and Kansas City. Kansas City would help you win. TJ Watt is the reason you were going to win this season. TJ Watt took Mr. Steeler Girl's pathetic-ass team and just flipped it throughout the course of the season, getting 301 fantasy points, outscoring most linebackers as an edge rusher. This is pretty uncommon in fantasy. It's happened a couple times with guys like Khalil Mack during his best season. Just a couple times. It usually doesn't happen too often where these edge rushers outproduce the middle linebackers. But this was one of those occasions where TJ Watt really stepped up to the plate, did fantastic. You can just look at the points. I don't really think I even need to explain this. The points for him were just fucking ridiculous. The only downside to him is as a linebacker, if he had those bad weeks such as he had against Houston, it would really hurt Mr. Steeler Girl. But I can't deny the fact that Mr. Steeler Girl's miracle run, a lot of it is directly because of TJ Watt. And Micah Parsons, as we talked about in the previous round. Mr. Steeler Girl went edge rushers for a lot more boom or bust. It seemed to have paid off for him as he made a Final Four exit. But overall, that was the round 18. Let's move on to round 17 here. At the number 12 pick, I had Karen's husband yet again taking Henry Mondeau, who just fucking... I don't know what Karen's husband was cooking on this on these couple rounds here, but Henry Mondeau, yet again, gets 0 points. Absolute bust for Karen. At the number 11 spot, it's J-Bay, of course, who had Ifedi Odenigbo. Regardless of the fact of how funny that name is, especially at the end part, he still had 0 points. And again, I'm putting J-Bay just a little bit higher, just because it's funny and his name is beautiful. At the number 10 spot, I had MILF taking Willie Goulston, or William Goulston as Yahoo calls him, who was terrible, but at least he scored points and had a couple okay weeks, such as against Buffalo. Other than that, he was terrible. This is another bust. At the number 9 spot, you had Dictatorship taking Nick Williams at the D-line position. The former Chicago Bear, unfortunately, did not do too much. He had a good week against Dallas, a pretty solid week if I do say so myself, an okay week against Miami, a solid week against Buffalo. But other than that, he really wasn't one of the better players, and this is still a bust. But at least he was putting up points year-round. At the number 8 position, I had Scrambled Wiggle Waggle taking Joey Porter Jr. Now, if this was off of real-life talent, this would have been a way better pick if you're Scrambled and Wiggle Waggle, but unfortunately, you need players that are going to put up fantasy points, and Joey Porter had a slow start, had an okay middle, and just bad end of the season overall. So I really couldn't put him any higher on this list. There were just so many better safeties out there, but at least he was scoring points, which is why he's above everybody else that we mentioned in this round. But make no mistake about it, that's still a bust. At the number 7 spot, I had Pussy taking Zach Charbonnet, who I'm going to call a bust here as well. 107 total fantasy points on the season. He had a good 4-week stretch where he was actually pretty useful, but outside of that, he was just bad, to say the least, throughout the rest of the season. And I'm still going to call that a bust. But for those 4 weeks, at least he was useful, and you had a good use for him. At the number 6 spot, I had myself taking Devondre Campbell at the number 6 spot, and I called this a bust. I had a lot of hope for him, but injuries just kicked his ass yet again, like they always do. He had a good week too, got hurt, fell off for a while, came back against Cincinnati, did good, fell off a little bit, got hurt, came back, did okay, got hurt. So yeah, you can kind of see the tails of this guy. He does nothing other than sit in a medical tent all season. So unfortunately, I couldn't call him any more than a bust. He's a very talented player, but he just gets hurt too much. At the number 5 spot, I had Mr. Steeler Girl taking At the number 5 spot, I had Mr. Steeler Girl taking Talanoa Hufanga. Now, at the start of the season, or the first half of the season, I guess you can say, this would have probably been a hit, but in the same situation as Devondre Campbell, he missed the entire second half of the season. I can't put him at anything higher than a bust here, but when he played, he was a very quality safety, getting around 20 points in quite a few games. But overall, I just couldn't put him in anywhere more than a bust just because of how many weeks he missed. And even when he played, he still had a couple bad weeks, such as week 5 against Dallas. But overall, I think he'll have a lot of upside in future fantasy seasons. This season just wasn't it, unfortunately, for Mr. Steeler Girl. At the number 4 spot, I had Big Yawners taking Minkah Fitzpatrick. And with this, I'm actually going to call this a bust, surprisingly enough. I thought for sure going into the season, I was like, okay, I was looking at all the lists and stuff like that. I'm like, okay, Minkah's going to be a hit. He always is a hit. No, not this season, not at all. He started out the first half of the season, almost, not even the full first half, doing pretty damn solid. He did pretty good. And that's what I was kind of thinking, okay, he's going to be a hit. But I forgot that he missed like 5 weeks in a row, came back, played 2 okay weeks, and then got hurt again and missed another 3 weeks. Again, this is just another bust. This round was full of people that just kept getting hurt and sent to the nursing home. Unfortunately, I can't call any of these players anything more than busts. They've all missed half the season. They all had a lot of potential, though, but unfortunately, just none of these players were able to stay healthy. I'm also noticing every single person in this round was actually a defensive player. I thought that was pretty humorous. But anyway, at the number 3 spot, I had Booty Basher taking Drew Tranquill at linebacker. Now we're finally getting out of the busts. I'm going to call this a meh. 181 points. It's a pretty solid performance, and he had a long stretch where he was actually a pretty good linebacker. But then Nick Bolton came back, and he wasn't a very good linebacker anymore. For context, Nick Bolton was a very, very good linebacker. He still is, but he got hurt throughout a point in the season, and that allowed Drew Tranquill to set up. I cannot fucking talk. Drew Tranquill to set himself up for a really good season, but when Nick Bolton was able to come back, Drew Tranquill just fell off again. But that middle course of the season, he was a very, very good and very useful linebacker for pretty much anybody. He could have been startable for almost every roster out there, with the exception of the teams that had elite linebackers. Um, and if Nick Bolton missed the rest of the season, this would have been a hands down hit. But unfortunately, I can't call it anything more than a meh, just because of the fact that Nick Bolton did come back and he kind of fell off. At the number 2 spot, I had Toxic Zenpai taking Kevin Byard. This is going to be an absolute hit at the safety position. Now, with Kevin Byard, in real life, he actually fell off quite a bit. He was getting cooked a lot. He just wasn't making the same plays he usually made. But in fantasy, he still had a very, very, very good performance until he got to the Eagles. Whenever he was still in Tennessee, you can see his points getting around 10 to 20 points every single week, like clockwork, with the exception of the week against Kansas City. But then he got traded to Philadelphia, and he kind of took a step back. But even then, he wasn't bad. He was just kind of taking a sharp step back from how good he did in the rest of the season. But overall, this is still a really good hit, and he was one of the better safeties in fantasy football until the last quarter of the season. And at number 1, you had PMC Wagner taking the Chicago Bear himself, safety Jaquan Brisker being a hit. With Jaquan Brisker, he scored just slightly less than Kevin Byard, but he was very consistent throughout the course of the season. His worst game all season was 7 points, and he did that twice throughout week 2 and 4. Other than that, he did really fucking good throughout the course of the season. Sure, he missed weeks 8 and 9. But you can look at his points, 10 to 15 to 35 to 20. He did very, very good, had a lot of upside, showed very good consistency when he was playing. And unfortunately, well, not really unfortunately, but fortunately for him, he was in this round and ended up doing really good. So this is an absolute hit for PMC Wagner, taking the number 1 spot in this round. Then we'll move on to round 16. This will be the final one we do in today's episode. At the number 12 spot, I had Scrambled Wiggle Waggle taking Terrell Lewis at the D-line position. With fucking Scrambled Wiggle Waggle taking Terrell Lewis, maybe if we were like in 2005, I'd say this is a bit better of a pick. But unfortunately, dude did nothing all season, and this is just an Evan pick. At the number 11 spot, you had J-Bay making his third 11 spot in a row. Ryan Anderson. You know, J-Bay ain't taking no 12 spots, but Ryder Anderson gets 0 points, but was taken just a bit after Scrambled and Wiggle Waggled, so he makes his way to the number 11 spot instead of at 12. At the number 10 spot, I had Karen's husband taking Dallin Leavitt as another bust. Dallin Leavitt had a whole 3 points on the season. Enough said. At least he had more than the other two. That's the only redeeming quality to him. At the number 9 spot, Dictatorship took MJ Stewart. This is another bust. Not Dalton Schultz. MJ Stewart at the safety position. He scored 41 points, had a good week 1 and 2, got fucking benched, and did nothing throughout the rest of the season. So yeah, if you're Dictatorship, enjoy your first 2 weeks of the season where he actually was good and then got benched. But yeah, that's an absolute bust, but at least he had 2 weeks of fame. At the number 8 spot, I had MILF taking Young Hoku, and this is a bust. I'm not calling it a bust because he's a bad player or because he performed poorly. It's a bust because he took a fucking kicker in round 16. If you guys are doing fantasy next year, do not take a kicker in any of the rounds except for the last round, and even then, you can probably find a good one on free agency, because even if you think you can predict who the best kicker is going to be, you probably can't. I hate to tell you, you can probably find a similar kicker off of free agency at any point in the season. After the draft, usually the guys that are expected to be the best kickers in the draft aren't actually the best. So you may as well just change your kicker out throughout the season and try to figure out who's going to be the best given the circumstances. Wasting a draft pick this early on a kicker is just asinine, to say the least. And like I said, he wasn't a bad kicker. He was overall a pretty damn solid kicker throughout the course of the season. And if he was taken later, this would have been a meh to a hit. But just taking a kicker this early just is a bad decision nonetheless. And this is kind of like an Atlanta Falcons situation. At the number 7 spot, I had myself taking, I think I took Budda Baker here. I took Budda Baker. And this is going to be a bust. I wanted to call it a meh to a hit so badly, but again, I just can't deny the fact that he missed 5 games in the early stretch of the season. And just, I really wanted to call it a meh, but I'm still going to call it a bust just to be fair. You can't expect a player that misses a third of the season to be anything more than a meh. But I'm still going to call it a. I don't know. I'm torn between meh and bust. I'm leaning towards meh just because of the fact that he did so damn good when he did come back. But you just can't ignore all those zeros. If you're looking at Budda Baker next season, he's one of those players, kind of like Minkah, where he'll probably almost for certain be one of the better safeties in fantasy football. But unfortunately, the injuries just killed him this season. And I'm going to call him a meh but borderline bust. At the number 6 spot, I had Toxic Zenpai taking Dalton Schultz at tight end with a meh. Who had 151 points. He played throughout the course of the season, and he was a pretty good tight end for the majority of the games. He did miss 2 weeks, but he did have a lot of bad games too. Week 1, Week 3, Week 17, Week 12. He just had a lot of bad weeks. Don't get me wrong, Week 12 he actually got hurt due to an injury. But overall, I can't put him at anything more than a meh, just because, similar to Budda Baker, he had so many bad weeks, or weeks not putting up the numbers he could be putting up. And overall, that just lands him at the number 6 spot with a meh. At the number 5 spot, I had Booty Basher taking Aaron Donald. This is going to be another meh. Aaron Donald is one of the better players of the last decade, but in this particular season, he basically got fucking 8v1'd every play by the entire O-line, plus tight end, plus running back, plus the quarterback was probably blocking him. Just the entire fucking organization is blocking this dude on pretty much every play. So unless you're against Cincinnati, who have guards that literally don't know what the sport of football is, Aaron Donald wasn't really going to do too much for you throughout most of the season. But he still found a way to have his occasional good games, and he still found a way to put up points in most of the games. But a lot of the games just weren't a lot of points just because, like I said, he really didn't get a chance to do too much. But overall, this is still going to be a meh. At the number 4 spot, I had Pussy taking Dalton Kincaid. This is a meh. I wanted to call it a hit, but like I said with the other guys, this is 6 weeks of the season where he's putting up mediocre to bad numbers throughout the course of the season. He has a very strong middle portion of the season, and then he gets to the final quarter. Now, I could have leaned this into being a hit if it weren't for the fact that he had 2 games in the final quarter of the season, one where he scored 0 fucking points because he wore the wrong pair of gloves, and then another game where he had 1.7. That was pretty much just the icing of the cake for me. I'm going to keep him at meh, leaning towards the hit category, but I just can't deal with how many bad weeks he had. At the number 3 spot, I had Big Yawners taking our first hit of the round, Jordan Hicks at the linebacker position. 211 fantasy points even after missing 5 weeks and having a bad week 1 in 17. Now, I really wanted to call this guy a meh to a not a bust, but I really wanted to call this guy a meh. But you can't argue the amount of points he put up when he was healthy. He was putting up 17 to 30 points almost every week, like it was clockwork. And I just can't deny the fact that he did that ridiculously good. So I think I'm leaning him just past guys like Dalton Kincaid and just barely into the hit category while also being borderline meh. At the number 2 spot, I had PMC Wagner taking Jordan Poyer. This is going to be a hit. And he only missed, I think it was 2 games he missed this season. And he was very consistent throughout the rest of the season, getting around 7 or 8 points on the safe side with some upside of around 18 to 20 some points. He had a very, very good season to say the least. And I'd say this is definitely a hit. He was one of the more consistent safeties in all of fantasy. I don't think this is a guy that's going to go out there and win you games, but it's one of those guys that's going to go out there and hold his own pretty much against anybody with the upside of helping you out. And then at the number 1 spot, I had Mr. Steeler Girl taking Zay Flowers at wide receiver. With Zay Flowers, just fantastic pick for Baltimore in real life, scoring 208 fantasy points, having so many good weeks over 10 points, with the exception of weeks 8, 9, and 15. He was actually one of the highest scoring receivers in fantasy football. He had those 3 really bad weeks, but you take those out of the average, and he would have been one of the best receivers in all of fantasy, like I said. He's one of the reasons that I wouldn't say he's one of the reasons, but Zay Flowers in general is just one of the reasons this Mr. Steeler Girl team did so good at that portion of the season. And yeah, you can just kind of look at the points and how fucking good he did it's hard to say anything other than Zay Flowers for this round. He's the obvious choice for the best hit. And I hope you guys enjoyed this video. I'll hit you guys with the round 15 to, I think we'll go to 13 in the next video. But either way, I'll catch you guys later. I hope you enjoyed.